So this is the Solution Explorer. And the first thing to note is that we have both a solution and a project. And this might seem a little bit redundant in our case, but a solution can actually contain multiple projects. And so it makes sense that you would have a solution, and that solution would, in our case, only contain one project. Now let's take a look at what's in this project. We'll work our way down from the top. For the time being, we won't do too much with the first two nodes, so I'll cover those quickly. We won't use properties in this project, but this is a really cool way to store application settings on the system. This is a .NET thing, though, and not something that is specific to WPF. I do want to explain a little bit about references, though. If you expand the References node, you'll see that this project has a lot of references. References come into play when there's external code, like a DLL or an external library, that we want to use from within inside of our project. All of the references that you see here are standard to a WPF application. In fact, most of these are references to standard .NET assemblies. A couple of them, though, are WPF specific, and I want to explain just a little bit about each of those. The first of these is Presentation Core. Presentation Core contains some of the core WPF services and libraries. These include things like media or shapes, some of the other media things that WPF can do. The second of these is Presentation Framework. And Presentation Framework contains what we generally refer to as the framework in WPF. This includes things like controls and layout and data binding. These are the high-level concepts which you use when you're creating an application or when you're creating UI. And then the last of these is Windows Base. And Windows Base contains some of the base classes and basic services that WPF offers. You don't really need to think too much about these references, though. They've already been added to the project for you by the template that we used. And these will be available to anybody who has .NET installed on their machine, so you won't need to redistribute those with an application that you build. The last two files that you see here are what we call XAML files. You'll notice that they have the extension XAML. Even though it might not look like it at first, that's actually pronounced XAML. The XAML stands for Extensible Application Markup Language. You can think of XAML as being something along the lines of HTML. XAML is a markup language. It's XML based, and we use it in WPF to create the UI for the application. In fact, most of what we do in this training is going to be about becoming familiar with the capabilities of XAML. So you'll notice that the file we have open right now is this bottom file, window1.xaml. And as we look at it, you can see the XML in here. The really cool thing about XAML is that every single tag corresponds to an actual object that gets created. So when you see a tag like this one, you can know that that means that in this XAML we're actually creating a new object of type window. The other thing to know about this is that each attribute that gets set on the XML node corresponds to a property on that object. So when we create this window, we're setting a number of properties as well. Some of the more interesting ones are title, height, and width. You can see then that we're creating a window and we're setting its title to be music player, we're setting the height to be 300, and we're setting the width to also be 300. We're also setting some rather cryptic looking properties. This is actually an exception to that rule. There is, for example, no XMLNS property declared on the window class. XMLNS is actually a standard XML attribute, which lets us declare a namespace for the tags in the document. We've declared two namespaces so far. The first of these is the default namespace. The default namespace is the namespace that contains all of the standard WPF tags that we're going to use, like window and grid, or button, or even rectangle or ellipse. Most of what we'll use inside of this application actually comes from this default namespace. There are times, though, that you want to bring in some code that doesn't actually exist in the default namespace. And in order to bring in that code, you declare an additional namespace, like the x:colon namespace, which is declared here. The x:colon namespace actually defines a number of special attributes that are XAML specific. For now, don't let the X throw you off. You'll be seeing it a lot. A good example of something that uses the x:colon namespace is up at the top of our window, and that's the x:colon class attribute which we set. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. So remember that when we first ran this application, we had a fairly small window that was pure white. I want to show you what happens when we actually change some of the attributes on the window class. First thing we can do is change the title. You can go ahead and call this whatever you want. I'm going to call this My WPF Music Player. We're also going to set the width and the height properties to some values that will become useful later on in the application. I'm going to change the height to be 330, and I'm going to change the width to be 460. Now if you're running a monitor that is running in 96 dpi, these will actually correspond to pixel values. But one of the great things that WPF does is it can work in virtual pixels. And that means that if you're running a monitor that is bigger or has a higher DPI than 96 by 96, the WPF will actually scale this up for you automatically and correspond to the size that it would have been if the monitor had been 96 DPI. This means that as an application author, you don't need to take high DPI monitors into account as you're creating the software, but you'll always get the best possible experience for that monitor. Finally, I'm going to set some new properties on this window that we don't have here.